So years ago, there was a product called Neat-lac. This is an old can of it. It's flammable. It's not something you want to breathe. It's an irritant, but it made an excellent leather finish, and especially on natural leather items that were carved. It was one of my favorites. Now Tandy is now making a new product that they're calling Neat-lac that I haven't tried yet. So I wanted to compare the two because I've got this old can of Neat-lac. I bought several of them when it was discontinued because it was one of my favorite finishes. And now I've got this new bottle of it. And I went ahead and carved two pieces that are very similar. I wouldn't necessarily call them identical, but they're really, really close. They're both off the same piece of leather right next to each other. So they should work about the same. They've both been carved in a similar fashion and oiled with pure neat's foot oil. Now this is important for a couple reasons because it's kind of the standard with Neat-lac was used a lot for Sheridan style finishes. And you would carve your piece and oil it, and then you come back the next day and you would put a resist on of Neat-lac. And then you would go back over that with your antique stain. But I think it made an excellent appearance just by itself, even without being stained, if you did your carving right. And so I would use it a lot on things that I was leaving a natural color. I recently made a video where I did an archery quiver, and I used Neat-lac on it as a finish. I don't believe I showed it in the video because it's a product that you really can't get is the old Neat-lac. Now the new Neat-lac. Obviously, a different solvent does not have that distinct Neat-lac smell. But it can be cleaned up with soap and water. Well, now we've got to let them dry and see if they come out anything like each other. So I've let these dry. This is actually a couple days after I put the finish on them. And you can see they look very similar to each other. A similar gloss, similar tone. They both changed and became a little bit darker than the natural leather. The old Neat-lac, which is this one, is a little bit darker in the backgrounding and in the areas where the leather was burnished, and a little bit lighter on the surfaces that were not carved. Whereas the newer Neat-lac is more of a consistent color all the way over. One thing that I did find interesting is that the paper towel that I used to wipe everything off actually came up with a little bit of a stain on it where I wiped off. So the new Neat-lac must have a little bit of color in it. It seems to be something similar to like a thinned down acrylic resin or a thinned down tan coat or something with just a little bit of color to it. Seems to be what we're working with. Now, it also seems to be a pretty good finish. It seemed to do fairly well, a neat appearance. But the next test is that we're going to take, and just like you would with most Sheridan carvings, which these aren't really Sheridan carvings, but I'm going to go use an antique stain on it. And we'll see how well it resists the antique stain. Now, antique stain always looks like you've made a horrible mistake and you're about to make a terrible mess with it. But you need to be prepared for it to be a mess. You need to put down some paper, you need to wear gloves. And you need to have some paper towels or something ready to clean up and clean off the surface kind of right away. All right. And I normally use the gel antique stains, but for this test I'm going to use the old-fashioned paste antiques because that's what I'm familiar with using on the original Neat-lac, which is what this sample is. Let's get a sheet more. Get in there a little bit better. And you see, the idea of this is just to bring out the cut lines and the tool marks without really coloring the piece of leather any more than it already was. And you just want to take and polish it up a little bit. And then I usually like to use, after it's dried, a spray finish over top of it. So that's the old Neat-lac. Now let's try the same thing with the new Neat-lac. So as you can see, these both came out very similar to each other. There's some slight differences. It seems like the old Neat-lac resisted the stain just a little bit more than the new stuff does. The new stuff, you can see something in the, like the pear shading and the flowers took a little bit of it that didn't show up as much in the old Neat-lac. But otherwise, they're very comparable. I didn't have any trouble really at all with either one of them. I guess the pros and cons of it, of course, obviously you can't get the old Neat-lac anymore unless you have some old cans of it like I do laying around. The new Neat-lac is available. The old Neat-lac, flammable, all sorts of health warnings. The new Neat-lac does not have any of that. I think it's basically an acrylic. Obviously, this stuff has a very noticeable scent when you're using it. It definitely gives off some fumes. Whereas this didn't really have too much trouble. You could smell something, but it was like an acrylic. It wasn't too bad. The old Neat-lac you could not use with acrylic paints. It would take them right off of the leather. The new Neat-lac, I think you can. So there's pros and cons to them, but they are very similar finishes and did come out close enough that somebody who didn't know any better wouldn't be able to hardly tell them apart. So I'm quite happy with it.